Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we have another case, as you saw in the title, and it's about Shannon Matthews. This story takes place in the United Kingdom in 2008. You can see my social media on the side if you want to check them out. I don't have anything else to add, so let's get started with this case because it's quite long. As I already mentioned, because of all the explanation we have, let's get right into the day everything happened, so you can understand absolutely everything better. On February 19th, 2008, which is when this happened, Shannon was 9 years old. She lived with her older stepbrother, who was 12, her younger half-brother, who was 5, and her little half-sister, who was 2 years old, whose father was Craig, Shannon's stepdad. Craig worked at the Morrison supermarket, while Karen, Shannon's mother, stayed at home and didn't do anything. She rarely cooked, and all the meals ended up being frozen. The fridge wasn't even full. She spent her days watching TV, to sum it up. Despite the poor quality of life Shannon had, which I'll explain in more detail later, she didn't seem to have any problems. In other words, she didn't look like a kid with any kind of anger issues. She was pretty calm, and you could even say she was shy. But like I said, that's just how it looked on the outside. She really did seem very calm. So on the morning of February 19th, Shannon sat next to one of her best friends, named Megan. Megan noticed something a little off about her that morning, because normally Shannon, even though she was a bit shy with everyone else, was always happy around her. They talked a lot, so it was weird that morning because Shannon was really quiet. What was even stranger was that they had swimming that day, and Shannon, she was usually really happy about it. She loved that activity, but that day, honestly, she was very calm. According to her best friend, it wasn't until the afternoon, when they were already at the swimming club, that Shannon was happy again. She started expressing herself like she usually did. She laughed. Everything seemed normal. The only thing worth mentioning is that, in the weeks before, she had been telling her friends that maybe it would be cool to run away. The thing is, for the other kids, this was nothing more than a joke, a game, something imaginary. However, for Shannon, maybe it meant something more. The last people to see Shannon that day were Megan, her best friend, who was with her that afternoon, and a teacher who was waiting for the bus they took back from swimming. Neither of these two people saw exactly which way Shannon went that day. This was at 3:10 p.m. on February 19th, 2008. If they got back from swimming at 3, that would mean she should have been home by 4. However, Shannon didn't come back. By 4 o'clock, she still hadn't shown up, and Karen, her mother, started to worry. Karen then went to knock on a neighbor's door, and he told her he hadn't seen Shannon either. So she figured maybe Shannon was just running late. There were a lot of friends' houses along the way from school to home, so she thought, well, maybe she's at a friend's house. So she went out to do some shopping, thinking that maybe by the time she got back, Shannon would already be home. However, that didn't happen. Karen got back home at 7 p.m. and didn't see her daughter. It was only at this point that she called the police. So the police officers knocked on the Matthews door at 7:15 p.m., 15 minutes after the call. Craig and the other kids answered the door, while Karen kept searching the neighborhood for her daughter. When the officers entered the house, they noticed a bunch of things that were a bit unusual. Like, for example, that the place was absolutely filthy. There were cigarette butts everywhere, and the smell of smoke was terrible, according to their description. There were dirty clothes scattered all over the house, as if it had never been cleaned. It was really unusual to have so many kids under that kind of care. A short time later, Karen came back to the house and she was visibly upset. The police asked her a couple of questions and she answered everything as best she could. They tried to ask her why Shannon would run away from home, because that's what they were thinking at the time. And Karen answered that one of her brothers had gotten a new computer and that she was jealous, so maybe that was the reason. Karen kept repeating over and over that her daughter was somewhere around. She was out there, alive somewhere. The officers asked if they could search the house, and Craig immediately got defensive. He responded by asking what they were trying to accuse them of. However, the police replied that this was just a routine procedure, meaning it didn't imply anything bad. They said that maybe by searching the house, they could find something that would indicate Shannon's whereabouts. Don't see this behavior as something too suspicious though, since in reality, most of the time, parents in these kinds of situations tend to get defensive, let's say. A daughter has just disappeared, so it's normal to think that the police should be trying to find other things instead of accusing the parents, which wasn't happening in this case. The other thing they thought was that maybe Shannon hadn't run away just anywhere, but had actually gone to visit her father, whom she hadn't seen for quite a while. However, they went to Leon's house, Shannon's father, and didn't find her there. In fact, he was extremely distressed because his daughter had disappeared. Obviously, from the very first minute, he started looking for her. He helped the police and neighbors try to find Shannon. So a search team was sent out, along with the neighbors, to see if she was still in the neighborhood. The whole community went out to look for the girl, but they couldn't find her. They didn't find any trace of her. The clothes she was wearing that day were missing too. Remember, she was going to swimming lessons that day, so she had a bag with clothes and a towel. None of these things were found. The next morning, Shannon's uncle, Neil, was already giving this statement. We searched everywhere, driving around the whole area until 4 a.m. We looked in the neighbors' yards and checked all the places she would normally go. We're very worried. We're in limbo now and we don't know what to do. It's completely out of character and unexpected for her to just leave. She's a quiet and very shy girl. She's not the kind of kid who would run away if she had a problem. This is all a mystery. So it's this morning, when they can't find her anywhere, that they start to think this might have been a kidnapping. So the major investigation team and the homicide investigation team were called in. These officers continued the search and went to Craig and Karen's house to look for new clues, to collect some things for DNA testing, to have them ready. And they took some things, like the family's computers. Every single available police department helped with the extensive search, going door to door, asking if anyone had seen Shannon, and trying to find anything important. Julie Bushby was one of the key people who led this massive search, along with all the concerned local residents who were desperately trying to find her. Now that I've given you all this information about how this happened, we can talk about Shannon's past, her childhood, and the relationship she had with Karen, her mother. Shannon Matthews' mother, Karen Matthews, grew up in Dewsbury. Karen left school at 16 and had her first baby at 17. Then she met Shannon's father, Leon. At that time, she already had her first child. A few months after meeting Leon, she got pregnant and they had a child together. Because of the demands of having to take care of the kids, the relationship between them became a bit tense. Despite this, at 23, Karen had another daughter. It was the third time she got pregnant. That was Shannon, born on September 9th of 1998. Shannon was taken to Karen's parents, June and Gordon, straight from the hospital. They had seen Karen's previous behavior and knew they didn't want to take on a third little girl. So they kept Shannon for the first few months of her life. Unfortunately, at some point she had to go back home and they had to send her to live with Karen and Leon. But just as they had predicted, Karen didn't want to raise her. In fact, she didn't even buy diapers. She used whatever was at hand, like curtains. Stella really didn't take very good care of her daughter. And the money she was supposed to use to support her, she spent on cigarettes and beer. Because of all these things, by the time she was 2 years old, Shannon watched as her father had to leave the house with her brother while she stayed with Karen at home. And the reason Shannon didn't go with Leon was because Karen basically told Leon to leave with only his son. She demanded it. By the time they were living in Moorside, which is where the events take place, Karen already had 6 children, 5 with different men. Although she moved to this place with only 3 of them, one of whom was Shannon. This is when Craig enters the story. They had met when Karen was 28 and Craig was 18. After a few weeks together, Craig moved in with Karen and the other kids at this house. And together, they had a daughter, Karen's 7th child. At this point, Karen was caring for 4 children, none of whom were even a priority for her. Because of everything the family saw happening, they reported the conditions the children were living in to social services. There was a whole investigation behind it. After some deliberation, social services decided that, in reality, these children were not in any danger. However, it could be argued that this decision was not well made, since, for example, social services would notify them before coming to the house. This gave Karen time to ask for money to fill the fridge and also to clean the house. Another small detail about Sharon's life before everything happened is that her teachers were very worried about her, and with good reason. They noticed she was lacking attention in a way that was not at all common for any child. It wasn't just that she couldn't concentrate in class, but that it took her a really long time to even pay attention or write anything. She couldn't focus enough to do something so basic. And on top of that, as an extra, Shannon would come to school completely dirty, as if she hadn't bathed in weeks. She was covered in dust, covered in dirt, and on top of that, she wore clothes that clearly hadn't been washed in a long time. Obviously, they also reported it to social services, but again, nothing was done. And unfortunately, as the final piece of Shannon's past, Karen ended up fighting with Leon, simply over money. So Shannon could no longer visit her father. She hadn't seen him in a really long time, and both of them were pretty sad about it. She was happy visiting him, laughed a lot with her brother, and had a great time. And what she really wanted at that moment was to stay with her father. However, Karen didn't let them. Now that you have all the context about the family, Shannon's past, and everything that happened to her, let's continue with the search. Almost immediately, the Sun News paper offered a £20,000 reward for any information leading to Shannon's safe return. In addition, they added another £5,000 from a donation, and almost immediately after that, it was announced through this newspaper that the reward would be £50,000. 24 hours after Shannon's disappearance, Karen reached out to the media. During these interviews, she usually looked very sad, but hopeful. Karen's words, every time she was interviewed, were hopeful. She always said that her daughter had to be somewhere, that she wasn't dead, but that someone simply had her. So the press stayed with her around her house. However, 7 days after Shannon's disappearance, she still hadn't turned up. They had spent an entire week searching for clues and nothing had come up. Let's remember that this was happening during the investigation of Marlene McCann. If you haven't seen that case, I have it in a playlist up here in the eye that's on the screen. You can go check it out. Anyway, the only thing you need to know about that case is that it's about a missing girl, and that the police were accused of being pretty negligent, not doing their job well, and acting very slowly. As a direct result of those circumstances, in this case, the police were careful to always be extremely prompt and perform their duties with maximum efficiency, since there was all that intense pressure on them. 13 days after the disappearance, that is, almost 2 weeks, Shannon appeared at a press conference organized by the police and posed for photos wearing a shirt that said, "Help find Shannon," along with one of her teddy bears. By this point, she seemed calmer. It was no longer a frantic plea for help. All the emotion had faded away. However, she kept repeating the same thing, that someone must have her daughter. I think it's someone out there who knows Shannon. They probably know me too, and I just want her to be safe. It makes me feel like I can't trust the people who are really close to me anymore. I just can't trust them. She was kidnapped, that's all I can say. Karen told the press that her daughter's last words were, "See you at tea time, Mom. I love you." By March 6th, West Yorkshire police had questioned 1,500 drivers and searched more than 3,000 homes. More than 250 officers and 60 detectives had taken part in the investigation. Half of the recovery dogs in the UK were used to search more than 500 homes, lining the route from Shannon's house to the school. They didn't find anything. The sex offenders register was also examined, and several CCTV tapes, which are the security cameras from the area, were reviewed. Along with this, several computer disks were also checked. So the search for Shannon became one of the largest and most important in 30 years. But nothing was happening, they just couldn't find her. As the media interviews went on, Karen and Craig were faced with increasingly tough questions. At one point, there were even rumors that they had been violent with Shannon, especially Craig. They were asked if this had ever been true, and if that was the reason Shannon might have wanted to leave. But Karen defended him, saying it was impossible that Craig could have been violent with his daughter. During the investigation, the police were actually quite focused on the family's entire family tree. At one point, they had a family tree so large it included 350 names. So they went to visit each one of them, one by one. And soon, they had a list of possible suspects, or people with significant information. As part of the investigation, Karen and Craig, along with Shannon's siblings, gave their DNA. Karen also handed over several items belonging to Shannon. With this, the officers were able to put together a complete set of Shannon's fingerprints and her DNA profile. If a discarded piece of clothing or even a body was found, the officers could directly compare it with Shannon's DNA and immediately know whether these things belonged to her or not. Let's also remember that Karen had a bunch of kids with different people, which really broadened the possible connections. The whole case takes a complete turn several days after the disappearance. On Thursday, March 13th, 2008, several people from the community organized a fundraiser party to help search for Shannon. And while that was happening, the police were investigating new information that had come in. It turns out that one of Craig's relatives had spoken with his uncle, Michael Donovan. This person is going to be pretty important for the rest of the case. The family member told Craig's uncle that the police were looking for a statement from him. The strange thing was that no one in the family, including Craig and Karen, had mentioned him before. They didn't mention him as part of the family tree, so the police weren't aware of him because of them. Thank you. So during the call, this relative asked Donovan if he would talk to the police so he could be ruled out, and he refused. So on the 14th of March, the officers made the decision to go and pay a visit to Donovan. This was a pretty strange situation. Like I said, they had never mentioned him as part of the family. Honestly, it's as if they hadn't even considered him. But there was also the fact that Karen used to forget her own children's names. So it was, like I said, a weird situation. So on the morning of February 14th, they decided that 2 detectives would go to Donovan's apartment to ask him a few questions. The people in charge of this would be Nick Townsend and Paul Kettlewell. They were the ones who had spent the last 3 weeks of the investigation talking to the family and looking for new details. So they were pretty involved in the investigation. Donovan lived in Lydgate Gardens, a large 2-story estate, in Barleycar. So these 2 officers arrived at the place, went up the stairs, and knocked on the door. However, absolutely no one answered. So before forcing their way in, for whatever reason, they tried to talk to the neighbors. One of them told the officers that the car he always used to go everywhere, he never went anywhere without it, was parked in his driveway. So they kept asking around the neighbors, and one of them finally told them she had been hearing noises upstairs. And after a few more questions, she also mentioned that she had heard what sounded like a child dragging their feet. It's important to clarify that Donovan's children no longer lived there, and in fact he had a girlfriend. So the neighbor just thought it might be one of her kids. She didn't think too much. I'll bet. However, for the 2 officers who were dealing with this whole mystery, all of this seemed really strange. So they called for backup. After a while, the team that was going to help them arrived. They gathered on the stairs and discussed what they were going to do. They ended up breaking down Michael Donovan's door. They went into his apartment, and there was no one there. The place was completely silent, which was obviously impossible, since, again, his car was downstairs, and the neighbor had said she was hearing noises. That's when one of the officers tries to open a bedroom door and realizes it's locked. They break down that door too. There was still the smell of cigarette smoke, and the sheets on the bed inside the bedroom were still warm. So someone had been using them recently. It's at that moment, when they go in and check that the sheets are warm, that a girl's scream takes them by surprise. They heard someone say, "Stop, you're scaring me." The sound was a bit muffled and was coming from under the bed. They checked the bed and discovered that some of its sides were solid. 2 officers tried to lift it, and with a lot of effort, once everything had been uncovered, a girl came out from a drawer under the hole in the bed. She tried to stand up, looking a bit confused. One of the officers helped her and took her outside. They also tried to look for Donovan. They asked her where he was, and she replied that he was there, where she had come from, under the bed. He was in a fetal position. Inside that space, inside that drawer, hoping not to be found, he was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping. Inside the bed, he had been found in a fetal position, as I mentioned before, along with 600 pounds in cash, a prescription for temazepam, and medication for dizziness. And a copy of the Sun newspaper with the headline about the 50,000 pounds. Reward for Shannon. The neighbors, who had gathered downstairs after hearing the news, and one of them finally asked if the girl they had rescued was, in fact, Shannon. At that moment, the police confirmed it was her. The missing girl was finally safe. After taking her to a safe place, they searched the apartment again. They found a long piece of fabric hanging down from a beam. Donovan would tie this fabric around Shannon's waist so she couldn't escape while he was gone. It was just long enough for her to move a little and go from the bed to the bathroom. Along with this, they also found a list of rules that said the following. You must not make any noise or stomp your feet. You must not go near the windows. Don't do anything unless I'm there. Keep the TV volume low, only up to 8 or less. You can play Super Mario games, you can watch some DVDs, and you can play music CDs. The police found 2 bags full of clothes near the door. Along with this, and the things that had been found on the bed, they suspected that Donovan wanted to leave, that he was about to escape. And in fact, a quick check of his record showed that he had tried to kidnap his own daughter some time ago. They believed that his intention then was to take Shannon with him. After this big discovery, obviously, Shannon's family found out. Leon was extremely happy. He was crying, saying he was so glad that his daughter was still alive. No one could believe it. Everyone who had joined the search for Shannon was very happy, grateful for the news. The neighbors who found out ran to Karen's house and told her what had happened. They told her that Shannon was alive. Even though she had shown emotion at that moment, when the cameras arrived and tried to focus on her face, she hid it. She hid from the cameras, trying not to show the expression she had at that moment. Even so, the reporter saw her. She wasn't smiling. In fact, she looked a little worried. They even had to tell her to smile.
Why, Karen?
She wasn't smiling? Even after the police arrived at the house and confirmed what had happened themselves, Karen, she didn't even ask about her daughter. She didn't ask how she was. Sharon was then at a police station, and Karen had been brought there so she could see her through a glass window. That's when they told Karen and Craig that they wouldn't be able to see her until the investigation was finished. Meanwhile, Karen looked at her daughter. After 24 days missing, seeing her through a glass window, she didn't show any concern. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, she did nothing. The only thing she managed to say while looking at her was, she has new clothes. She was no longer placed under emergency care by social services and would remain under police protection for 72 hours. Karen and Craig were put up in a hotel for the night so they could get some rest from the press. The first thing they did was interrogate Michael Donovan. They wanted to know what the reason was behind kidnapping this girl. So he told them about the plan Karen had proposed to him. He says that she approached him. With this plan, which was her idea, she told him that he would have to take care of Shannon for a while. Then they would report her missing, and after that, they would collect the reward. When the reward reached 25,000 pounds, Karen called him to say that when it hit 50,000 pounds, she would give him new instructions. However, when it reached 50,000, Karen didn't call him before the police caught him. Donovan also said that he couldn't get out of this, that he couldn't refuse, because Karen had threatened him, that if he didn't go along with the plan, she would send people to hurt him. Let's get to know a little bit. So, the life of Michael Donovan. Who was this person? He was actually born as Paul Drake. He was the youngest of 9 siblings. He grew up on a farm not far from where they found Shannon. Later on, he started getting into trouble around age 11, setting things on fire and robbing stores. When he was 16, he was charged with criminal damage and ended up running away from home. By the time he was 19, he had already changed his name to Michael Donovan. He found a job as a laborer at an engineering company, and honestly, he didn't prove to be a very good worker. He had met Karen in November of the previous year. They quickly became very close, to the point where there were rumors they were having some kind of affair. And that's how it gets to this point, when Karen supposedly gives him this plan. During the weeks following the discovery, Shannon was under protection and was asked a few questions in sessions, trying not to disturb her. After the police protection ended, she ended up staying with a family called the Kirkliss. Then, on March 17th, 2008, Michael Donovan was finally charged in court with kidnapping, held in custody. And while all this was happening, Karen's friends and family were quite worried. She wasn't showing any signs of wanting to know what was happening to her daughter. The police had told her that her daughter wouldn't come back until the investigations were finished. They didn't know how long that would take, and Karen hadn't been worried, not in the slightest. She hadn't even shown that she wanted her daughter to come back. However, the real reason why Shannon couldn't return to her family was because of the accusations against Donovan. Now, Karen was in the police's sights. Then, on April 2nd, sometime later, Craig was arrested. It turned out they had found images of children on his computer. Child pornography. The day after this, Michael Donovan was released on bail. After all these events, the family was definitely getting a bit tired of Karen's attitude. They were already suspecting the same thing as the police, without knowing Michael's story. So Julie Bushby, who was one of the people leading the search, along with a friend named Natalie, decided to do something about it. They spoke with one of the officers in charge of communicating with the family and told her what they were planning. So, the three of them agreed on a plan. The police picked up Karen in their car and went to get the other two women. After a few moments, they started questioning her about certain things. They began telling her that there were rumors she had been involved in the kidnapping. And that's when, after a few questions, and especially after that one, Karen broke down in tears and said, "It's true, everything is true." Karen was then immediately arrested. Donovan and Karen each told their own separate stories to the police, but they ended up being pretty contradictory. In the end, what could be concluded was that they met up at a small local cafe. Karen arrived with her youngest daughter strapped into her stroller, and while they were having a snack, she presented her plan. Initially, she said that Donovan would take care of her older son in what would be a staged kidnapping. When Donovan refused to do this, he explained that he didn't even know her older son. Karen then changed her plan. She decided that Shannon was a much better option, and that the reward for helping to find her would probably be much higher. On the other hand, Craig, Shannon's stepfather, pleaded not guilty, but was later found guilty of 11 counts of possession of child pornography. All these images had been found stored on his computer, which, as I mentioned before, the police had confiscated during the investigation. He was sentenced to 20 weeks in prison because he had already served some time before. Michael Donovan and Karen Matthews were tried together at the Leeds Crown Court on November 11th, 2008. The trial lasted just over 3 weeks. Neither of them showed any emotion when they were brought into court. The court heard how Shannon said she didn't know anything about what was happening and that she had been tricked that day. She agreed to let Donovan take her home from school with the promise of taking her to a fair. Instead, he locked her up. On the other hand, to make matters worse, we have forensic toxicology reports. According to them, the tests that had been done on Shannon indicated that she had been given temazepam as well as motion sickness medication, that is, anti-nausea drugs, to subdue her while she was being held captive. Further tests also revealed that these drugs had been administered to Shannon as early as 20 months before her disappearance. This would explain why she was so distracted at school, something her teachers and friends had noticed. Karen ended up testifying, saying she had nothing to do with it, while crying. On the other hand, the prosecutor told the jury that Karen had given the police 5 different versions of the same story. Because of all this, Karen, at 33 years old, and Donovan, at 40, were sentenced to 8 years in prison after being found guilty of kidnapping. Both Karen Matthews and Michael Donovan were released in March 2012 after serving half of their sentence, 4 years. Once Karen was released, she was taken to a women's shelter in the home counties in a private car. She was given a makeover and a new identity. On her first outing with the staff, she was immediately recognized, which tells us that, at the very least, she won't be able to walk the streets in peace, since everyone around her knows the story. After everything that happened in court, the only thing I can tell you is what happened to Shannon Matthews. Afterwards, she was given a new life with no possibility of ever seeing her family again. This included her grandparents, who had been with her for a long time, who had supported her and tried to give her a good life. Let's remember that they took care of her. During the first months of her life, they were never able to see her again. Nor could her friends. She was never able to return to this town to see them. The protection they put in place for her was like that. She had to start a new life without any of the people she had known before, even though she actually had a lot of friends at school. Gordon, her grandfather, he made a statement years later after seeing a photo of his granddaughter, now as an adult, saying this: "My only wish is that when she's old enough to truly understand what happened, she'll come and knock on the door. But I'm afraid it will be too late and I won't be here to see her. I'll be up there, in heaven, watching over her." And well, that was the whole case for the day. It's really not tragic, so to speak, since nothing actually happened to the girl in the end, and she was able to rebuild her life far away from people who were obviously harmful. But yeah, it was a mystery that took weeks of investigation and worry from people who knew her and cared about her. The only thing I truly regret is the fact that, well, the people who cared about her never got to see her again. And, well, that's the whole video for today. I hope you liked it. You already know that my Patreons are listed on the side, those who support me through the page. Below, you'll find the link for those who don't know what I'm talking about. And, well, that's it. Here's a new video, here's a recommended video, and you can subscribe by clicking on my face. And I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye!